Hi, I'm back this morning with Lori Ashley from Preservica, and we're going to do some follow-up questions for the webinar, Are Your Organization's Long-Term and Permanent Records and Information Future-Proofed? Welcome back, Lori. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Ann. Good to be with you.
So we roughly grouped these questions into three broad categories. We had some questions on digitization, and then sort of the difference between digital preservation systems capabilities versus ECM capabilities, and then some information on ingest workflows. So first up is the digitization. This is actually not specifically a digitization webinar, so we want to dispose of those questions pretty quickly. Lori, do you have any thoughts on that before we move on to the digital preservation system capability versus ECM?
Well, just to say, we're well aware that there's a lot of digitization activity going on, whether it's the drive for online access or people wanting to move away from paper systems and one-time access. There are many international standards, good practices, consulting firms, vendor organizations that are highly skilled in digitization of all sorts of different types of content. And so basically, once it's in digital format, Preservica is ready to ingest it, but we don't really deal with the digitization side. So I would say seek expert advice, and there's lots of it.
So let's move then to the digital preservation system versus the ECM capability. We answered one of these questions live, but again, because there's a cluster of these, I think it's worth reiterating, and I'll just read through these. Some of them we will have asked and answered as we've gone, but just to make sure that those questions are on the record for people that they know that they've been responded to. Right. So how does Preservica work with an ECM was the first question.
So really, Preservica is a digital preservation repository. So it's intended to take, fixed objects that don't need to be revised. And of course, an ECM system is very powerful in collaboration, versioning, all sorts of capabilities when the work is in progress or live. And so that's the core difference. The way that Preservica works is that we have lots of different ways that you can ingest content. We've been working over the last couple of years of making that more streamlined because of the significant need. And so right now we've developed sort of auto archiving engines that work with OpenText and SharePoint, and we're working on embedding preservation inside the Microsoft environment so that we can get the connection between records which are ready to be preserved and the content systems where they're stored, have that be seamless and transparent and automated and scalable.
Okay. The next question in this area, and I think it relates to some of what you've already touched on, is an issue with preservation ecosystems I've experienced is the bridge between the record creation and determining final versions for records retention. Users often don't want to determine what is a final version and don't want to have to act on them to move them to an area of that other system so that they can link to retain them. How do you get around that gap in creation and retention?
Right. So I think the way that we have to try to make it work is for triggers and actions inside the content system to be readable, say, by the preservation system. So in the early days, if someone dropped something into a folder, Preservica could watch the folder, and as soon as it was in the folder, Preservica would kick off the ingest workflows. In the future vision of what we could do in the Microsoft environment, it would be more driven by the policy. So the things that you set up around those objects, if it's a contract and at some approval stage, the machines know that trigger event makes it eligible, if you will, for preservation. And so there will be ways to leave it so it's visible to the user, although it's being preserved in the preservation system. So we've got to evolve to the point where people just doing their work helps to set up the conditions for the machines to be able to identify objects which need preservation and then take care of them without disrupting the user.
So it still lives from the user's perspective, it still lives where they're used to seeing it.
Yeah, they can't tell the difference. That's where we've got to evolve to, because humans are humans. They want to get on with the next bit of work. They're hesitant about making a decision. But we have to have a fixed object in order to, put it into a preservation environment. You can always download it from the preservation environment and, use it again and make a new version. But once it's going towards the preservation repository, it's a fixed object.
So the next question in this group is it possible to program retention into a preservation system so it can work as an ECM as well?
Yeah, it's a great question because we've been saying for a long time that long-term as well as permanent electronic records are going to need preservation action, right? So Preservica comes from the archival side of the equation in its early days, but based on user feedback and the reality of the world, we have in recent editions built-in retention management. It's not as smooth and sophisticated as you'll find in a records management application, a DoD certified system, but you can include policy in the metadata, and then it will run routines, and it will present things to you that are eligible for disposition, and then they can be removed from the preservation repository. But retention management in Preservica is a relatively new feature. I think it's going to get more sophisticated because we're seeing that increase in the need to move long-term, not just permanent records, into a place where preservation actions can be taken over time.
So the next one is I think about some of that interconnectivity. Does Preservica provide an ECM? And I think you've sort of touched on that. It's not exact and preservation module, or is it necessary to integrate with another ECM and Preservica? So I think you've kind of touched on this already. It's not Preservica is not an ECM exactly. So
no, I mean, I guess you could say there's like the work in progress, things that will need preservation. There's a humongous backlog that is what we're seeing among prospects and customers. They've been digitizing imaging records for decades, right? Especially in government sector. Now they want to move them into the preservation repository. So they're sitting someplace, right? There's content in lots of different places, sometimes specialized applications, sometimes they're just unstructured, documents that are easy to handle. And then there's all the other more complicated stuff of, databases and CAD systems and GIS systems and things like that. So we're evolving to where the understanding and the need for preservation is much larger than it used to be. It used to be really in the archival side, which is has its own rules and conditions, but it's easier in the sense that the custody is with the archives, the legal and physical custody there. In records management, it's the Wild West, right? Because the content's still owned by the people that created it and needed it.
And I think this last one in this section is, again, one that you've talked about already, but I just want to see if you got anything to add. So are they, I guess, the records ingested as users save the records in their application? So this is, again, about that interconnectivity. Can we talk a little bit more? So we talked about putting it in a folder and having it grabbed from the folder. Can you talk a little bit more about that seamlessness, how the user experience is that the record is still there and how that works?
Yeah, I mean, that's really where we're evolving to. So the machines will be able to figure that out based on the metadata on the objects. So the user won't have to do anything but their normal work. But we're a ways away from that being, seamless and automated and at the scale that the whole world's going to need. So right now, it's usually there's some disposition action which cuts it off. So for example, we use the LA County. What they're doing is they take in real property records over multiple weeks. They do quality control. They decide there's a disposition cutoff, and then they move that batch of content into the repository. So there's lots of ways to do this, but it's always, people, process, and technology. You've got to fit the pieces together and make it make sense for your business, for the workflow, for the users. Once it's ready, whatever that means, we're moving to the point where the machines can know what's ready. Right now, there's still a lot of human intervention in that transfer process.
And I find too that people have I'm wondering what your thoughts on this, that people have a different sense of how much they need access to these records. So there are some things that people are using on a regular basis, and there are other things that they're only accessing on a rare occasions. So having it in that digital preservation environment for those types of records might be substantially less disruptive. So it's about helping people disentangle those different types of records that can actually be put away in a longer term storage and less accessible, but more hardy preservation environment.
Yeah, and I mean, things in a preservation environment can be more accessible than ever, right? Because they're easier to find. They've been curated, and they have a ton of metadata wrapped around them. And of course, from the archival side is all about preservation for access, for future access, right? And so things that are in the archives are prepared and processed that make the access way easier and faster and more efficient
Right
and
there.
more robust than happens inside where the record creators are doing it, which tend to be more siloed, right?
It's a lot more, it's a lot more findable than,
yeah,
Ann Snyder's filing structure or Lori Ashley's filing, structure that may be different if we're not, following some kind of consistent methodology.
yeah. So in the discoverability in a preservation system is really, really powerful and robust. Whether or not you make them that that open to access by the public or by internal staff, those are other decisions that have to be configured. But in terms of being able to find it and discover it in the repository, you can find things you never knew you had.
Right, because that's its purpose built to be able to help people find it long term, right?
Yep.
No, and I think that's a really important part to emphasize. Again, people think about the accessibility, but it's not super accessible if you can't find it. If you're drilling down into the file folders and things like that, or you don't remember where you put it. This purpose-built long-term preservation environment is specifically designed to help you not just keep it viewable and readable and its integrity intact, but also its findability as well. So let's move to the next. I think we've disposed of most of those. Thank you so much on that. So we're talking a little bit now about like what's happening, the mechanics of what's going on in the ingestion process. There were some questions around that. So can you, the first one is, can you discuss more about characterization against a file format registry? That was, so on the slides that we have from the deck, which people will have when they're listening to these questions, that was one of the first steps was, file gets pulled in and then it gets characterized against that file format registry. What exactly is happening there, Lori?
Yeah, it's a really important point. We all are familiar with file format extensions, right? PPT, spreadsheets, whatever, but those sometimes are not telling, and you can change those things even, and it doesn't match what what application the object came out of. So characterization is a process where the system goes out and tries to match the underlying complexity of the file format to a registry, and the registry is called Pronom, and it's managed by the National Archives in the United Kingdom. And when Preservica started out, it was a project with the National Archives, and the creation of that registry was part of the project. So today, the Pronom registry, and we can include a link or provide additional information, holds more than 1,900 file formats. So what happens is the system goes and looks at the object and matches it against what the registry says. And then you know exactly what it is, what version of software it was created, what application it was created, because all the preservation action that you want to take in the future is dependent on what it is that you're trying to preserve. So characterization is the process of linking, of mapping what the object is to that file format registry and then giving it a tag, which is then preserved in the system. And then what Preservica does is it has a version of that, and then we always go out to the Pronom registry on a periodic basis and update. So Preservica's system has the built-in capability to map against that registry. And then as it's pulled in, it has those unique identifiers, and that information is saved as part of technical metadata.
At a high level, can you just talk through what the process is? So now I know, okay, it's this ancient file format. Great, I know what it is. Sometimes I might even be able to see that information. I might say, oh, I know what it is, but that's great. Now, how does it get from that format, again, not down to the weeds, but like, how does it get converted to a format that I can now read?
So, right. So what happens is that the first step is that characterization. It figures out what is the signature that goes along with that object. And then the system has hundreds of workflows. And so you can say, whenever I bring in a WordPerfect file, I always want it transformed into PDFA. And in the, our new starter edition, that some of that stuff's automatically done based on best practice. But in the full core system, organizations decide on their own what are those file format that they want to do. And then the workflow just does it. It takes objects of this kind. You can do it on ingest, or you can do it in 20 years time when you say everything in my, all my WAV files in my repository, I want to have transformed into something else. The other way that it happens is usually preservation copies are high resolution and tend to be very large files. So what archives will often do is create a preservation master copy, store that into storage, which is less accessible, a little bit slower, and then they'll generate an access copy, which works better with web browsers, right?
Okay.
Because that's how people are But all those settings of how do you know, what is the preservation copy, what access copies do you want to generate? There's hundreds of workflows that have been figured out with best practices to what you want to do.
And can you see in the, as you know, if you're the end user, can you see that, you know, I'm using an access copy versus
Yes.
you can make the distinction visually while you're looking at it. So you know that there is a preservation, a more detailed preservation copy
And
somewhere
users
else.
don't really care, right? I mean, it's the archivists or the curators that really care about the, you know, the high res. Every single bit and byte has been preserved to the highest level, and then the people who are accessing it, say online, want it fast, right? They want the video to load, they want it to render, they want to be able to search and move around. So they often don't care. It's done for their benefit, but it's not really all that interesting to them.
So the next one here is sort of, again, the example, and this is an example that was discussed in, I think it was when you were doing the demo starter, was a document, was an old file format. Preservica could open it, great, but what about data in a database where a municipality wants to move to a new software? Preservica can't open all the operating systems like unique special utility billing programs, I wouldn't think. So, I mean, I have some thoughts on this one, but I was wondering, you know, if I mean, surely you've had to deal with preservation of things that are in databases. So there's the object maybe associated with the databases within that system, you know, a PDF or something like that that's attached to all of that other information. How do you handle systems like that?
Well, I'll say broadly, there's a lot of open source and commercial products in this space, right? And I mean, Preservica happens to be fairly well known, and part of the power of Preservica, it's integrated. It goes from ingest to an access portal, right? But there are some products that are more highly specialized for database management, and especially you see this in the pharma industry, and one that you're familiar with. They have, you know, proprietary databases and systems that they don't even own, right? There's some third party that's managing them. So Preservica can take any digital content in and preserve it down to the bit level. The issue is sometimes rendering, right? You can't see it because we don't have the application to render it because it's proprietary. So, you know, sometimes people will put it into the preservation repository to save it. They'll have to take it back out and put it into a specialized system to run it or reuse it. I mean, that's not uncommon. I think we've also seen databases and other applications that are shut down, and organizations want to figure out what to save and what to let go. And that is a separate process that happens outside. There's a lot of work that's done to say what needs to come out of this system before it goes into the preservation repository. But a good example, we've done that with, you know, millions of records coming out of, say, a Lotus Notes database, and you have to just figure out what has to happen in between in order for it to get into the preservation repository in a form that can be rendered.
And you're of course you're taking it out in a form that you're reducing the information in those tables to something that's like you know, a document or an object. If you want to preserve it that way.
I mean, we're not built as a data warehouse, right? And so that's a whole nother part of technology where people want to take data sets and set them aside and make them available. So yeah, we're in a pretty complicated technology and information environment. And so, yeah, some of it's easy, the unstructured, the documents, photographs, you know, digitized images, all that sort of stuff is really easy to suck into Preservica. Other types of things are more complicated and may need different types of systems to preserve.
The next one is a, you know, common problem we run into in, say, discovery, you know, accessing these, you know, linked items. So how do you preserve spreadsheets with links to multiple systems and other records?
Yeah, that's going to be a
break.
problem in a system like Preservica. I mean, I can tell you what happens. Where it does work in our system is we can ingest websites, and we have lots of customers that routinely harvest websites, and those linkages are retained. When you open a website inside Preservica, it will take you to all the links when that page or that site was captured. But right, and maintaining the linkages to multiple systems, that's a bigger problem than a preservation system can solve.
And that is a common problem, and it's, you know, if you break the link, it can be broken, and there's not a whole lot you can do. So if you've removed that object from its normal environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of this webinar and part of the message to RIM practitioners is we've got to figure out some of this stuff sooner on, right? Like we we need preservation policies. We need, with our retention schedules, to signal disposition triggers which maybe move content. So that's really the genesis behind this, is to get this group of practitioners and professionals to see these issues which they are well aware of, and now have some strategies for how to integrate it into the governance, into the systems, into the triggers, into the interoperability, if you will, between where content's created and where it may need to be preserved.
So one more question in this area, this general topic. You mentioned preserving context of information. Does that include chain of custody, creation dates, and systems? What data attributes are most important to retain over the digital long term?
Well, there's so many of them. I think when we talked about characterization, we're talking about a lot of the technical metadata. So it will capture the creating application, the file format, the number of pages, number of characters, all that sort of stuff is held in technical metadata. But there's multiple other types of metadata, structural and administrative and descriptive. And on the archival side, descriptive metadata is a major part of the domain and the profession. It's adding all that context of who created it and what does it relate to, and so the system preservation systems are built to be mega metadata machines, and so the chain of custody happens because from the time it comes into the repository, every action is recorded in metadata. That's how chain of custody and authenticity. I talked about virus checks and integrity checks, hash digest being placed on the file, and those are run periodically in the system, and that's how integrity and authenticity is preserved and documented in the system. And everything in the preservation system is auditable. You can get down to to the actual object and everything that's happened to that object since it was ingested. So it's the rich metadata of multiple different kinds that all combine, whether it's brought in with the object or added after the object is in the repository, that gives you that really, really robust context that sits with the object for the rest of its life.
So the idea is you're not limited to just what is part and parcel to that object. You can enrich that yourself.
Yeah, and that's what archivists do. Right. They're enrichment specialists, right? Yeah.
So related to, actually, let me just move on just for the sake of time here. Just comments and thoughts. We had a couple loose ends questions here. As you discuss the, actually, no, let me ask this before we get to that, just so people have a better sense of what's going on in the environment. So you mentioned the hash values, that it's sort of grabs a hash value when it comes in, and it's checking that on the back end routinely to make sure that it is fine. It's like walking in to your making sure the temperature and the temperature settings and the humidity settings are right in your physical archival preservation environment. So what happens when you find that something's happened? So a rat has started chewing on the paper, and we see a hiccup in the hash value. There's a problem. What do you do?
What happens in Preservica? So archival storage is a really important part of a purpose-built repository. So what happens when something's ingested is that 3 copies are distributed into cloud storage in geographically dispersed locations, which at least 3 copies is an archival tenant, right? So the system is self-healing. So what happens is that it will run checks on the data, and if one of the copies something happens, a bit or byte drops off or becomes corrupt, it will self-heal. It will use one of the existing copies and it will regenerate a copy. So that's running all the time, and the system just does it naturally.
Can you get a report to see that that's happened, that you had an issue? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, I just wanted to digress on that. I just wanted people to have a better sense of what's going on behind the scenes mechanically or digitally, so people understand why this is a different environment than just
I mean, it's purpose built as a forever repository, so it has those those security capabilities built in, because you can't afford to lose what's in there, right?
All right, so just the final comments, thoughts, questions. So as you discuss the pain of losing information, perhaps you may add some thoughts about the risks of having missed some during capture. In other words, when someone realizes that the entity responsible for capturing did not entirely capture it all. I mean, this is just a broad thoughts of Lori Ashley on this. It's a problem that I think we all encounter in this work that we do, is that some critical information sometimes doesn't get captured, and that's part of the problem. But
yeah, I mean,
not necessarily digital preservation specific, but
right. I mean, we are losing information all the time, right? I mean, that's just the way that it is. I think it's a clear case what happens in digitization. Sometimes the record creators will digitize it for their own reasons. By the time it gets to the repository, time has passed, and so when the person processing it gets it into the system, they'll find that there's a page missing, or that, especially if it's a document that was handwritten, or so it's possible to first of all, you can take things out of the system, you can deprecate them, right? Archivists tend not to decommission or deaccession things, but you can do it. And then there are ways in which you can, say, insert the content back into the object. Let's say it's a multi-page, TIFF or something. So there are means to do it if you somehow catch up with the fact that you've lost information, or that page didn't render properly and you need to rescan it. So it's not an uncommon problem, and it can start early on, and you may or may not be able to catch it around the time you're processing in a preservation repository. Or maybe you take something in and it's down the road when a user signals to you. Somebody accessing the object in the future might tell you something's missing, or so yeah, I think we'll be dealing with those sorts of issues. Some are easier to correct than others.
And I think this goes into why we need to be thinking about this now, this long-term preservation, and making it as seamless, as easy as possible, sort of for the end user, because again, people are, we put it off. If I have to manually move this stuff into the digital preservation environment, I'll do it tomorrow. I'm in the middle of my work day. I'll move that file. I'll move it into the folder tomorrow, and then tomorrow doesn't happen, or something happens to the file in the meantime. So making any of those steps seamless, easy for the end user is one way to get over some of this hurdle. We'll never, I don't know if we'll ever fully get to the point where we don't lose something because of carelessness or other issues that can come up.
I guess one other angle to think about it. I mean, I think for people have been digitizing, like using copy machines, right? So the users upstream, and the archivists have been fairly okay with that, because they didn't have the capability to transform file formats on their end. If you have a preservation system, you don't need people to do that action upstream, which will take away some of the mistakes, or the irregularity, or the sloppiness that sometimes happens. If they can give it to you in the native format, and you have a preservation system that's capable of transforming it, it can maybe take away that step that created some of those gaps. It's just a thought.
All right, one more quick question on this one. It's a general question. What types of professional tools and staff are available out there?
What we see commonly is when someone gets a preservation system, they want a digital archivist. So there's the archival profession, and they have certifications just like we do in the records management world. There are digital archiving certifications. So people are actually going through training. And so typically people have an electronic records analyst or a digital archivist, who is the person who's sitting down actually moving content into the system. But there are international standards, there are professional associations, there's great organizations like the Digital Preservation Coalition that have handbooks and guidance documents and assessment tools and things like that. So I think we can gather up some of those and put them into a job aid, and that might be a really good resource for people as they move down this road.
Okay. And just, we're going to include, we did conduct 3 polls during last week's webinar, and we will include that data here. This one was just some basic division of who was on the call, so which describes your organization and sector. We'll include this information here. We had a lot of people who were from the commercial and corporate sector, and also a good number of people in government and public service. That was the biggest sector. This one, I think, Lori, we wanted to comment on. How do you rate permanent electronic records preservation capabilities at your organization? This was a choose one, and possibly we should have done choose more than one on this one. But we can see here that basic capabilities, we're just using IT systems to preserve our records. That's 46%. And we also see that a lot of people are still learning about the topic, 16%. Or building the business case. So what very few, it's relatively few, only 18.2% are actually actively using specialized preservation tools and staff. So do you have any thoughts on this, Lori, before we wrap up shortly?
Well, and given the number of government representatives, I'm a little surprised about the low number for the rely on paper and film, because I'm aware of many jurisdictions that don't allow yet for digital preservation of permanent records. There are states, and then just based down at the local level, there are counties which are still relying on film and paper. And so that surprised me a little bit, but the fact that most people are using what they have is not a big surprise. And so I think it is something that we have to work towards, is to educate what is the difference between, or what are the capabilities that a system has that we don't have in our current portfolio. And that's a journey with the IT folks, because they of course want to leverage systems they have and not add a new one. So it's part of the education, but there's also some good resources out there to help our IT colleagues understand why this might be useful in the organization.
And again, I really wish I had made this choose more than one option, because I think that there are certainly buckets of information that might be getting that specialized preservation treatment, whereas the masses of information are doing basic, relying on basic IT tech, capabilities and stuff like that. So we could parse this a little bit more. And then finally, we had asked people which types of long-term and permanent records are they most concerned about. We did a word cloud here. Again, this will be included in the pack of information that we send you. Lori, do you have any comments on this?
The usual suspects, right? I mean, governance documents, meeting minutes, personnel records, student records, lots of engineering sort of materials, infrastructure, transportation, land records, which are born permanent. So yeah, good to see validation about the things that people are well aware are going to need some preservation care.
Okay, well, I think that's it for us today. Lori, again, thank you so much for being here with us again, making time for us. We very much appreciate it. And we are grateful for the support that Preservica has given us and for sponsoring this webinar. And again, have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon, hopefully.
Thanks, Ann.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye now.